She was just another invisible cleaner working in the city's largest luxury mall. At 52, Grace had been cleaning the same hallways for 18 years, never once noticed by the customers who hurried past with their expensive designer bags. But on one cold winter night, everything would change in a way she could never have imagined. She witnessed a scene that most people would prefer to ignore, pretend they didn't see, and move on with their lives. 3 security guards were brutally beating a dirty, ragged, homeless man at the service exit, far from the cameras and the eyes of society. She had only 2 seconds to decide: stay silent and keep the job that fed her 3 children, or defend a complete stranger and risk absolutely everything. What this humble woman did in that moment, without knowing who was truly being beaten, changed her life forever in ways that not even the most impossible dreams could have predicted. Because the homeless man was not who he appeared to be, he was not another invisible person discarded by society. He was the billionaire owner of the mall in disguise, testing to see if genuine kindness still existed in his empire of concrete and glass. And when the world discovered what she had risked for a stranger, when the truth came to light, everything changed, not just for her, but for thousands of people. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching from, which city, which country. We love to know and read every comment you leave. Now, let's get to the story of this incredible woman who taught us the true meaning of courage. Grace was on her knees on the cold concrete floor, her arms trembling as she shielded the bloodied body of the homeless man, groaning in pain. The security guard's baton was inches from striking her head, the air cut by the menacing sound of hard plastic slapping against his palm. "Get out of the way or you're next!" shouted the uniformed man, his face red with rage, veins bulging in his neck. But she didn't leave, didn't move an inch, even as her entire body shook with fear. Even knowing she would be fired, even knowing her children depended on that meager salary, she remained there like a human shield. What makes a person risk absolutely everything: job, security, their children's future, to defend someone society considers disposable, less than nothing? Why did Grace choose a dirty homeless man, reeking of urine and alcohol, over her own survival and the survival of her 3 children waiting for her at home? And more importantly, how many people would do the same if they knew they were being tested, that someone was watching, judging their choices? The answer to these questions will reveal not only who Grace was, but who we ourselves are when no one is looking. When doing the right thing costs everything we have, and doing the wrong thing gives us everything we want. The smell of urine and mildew mixed with the metallic odor of fresh blood in the cold July night air. The screams echoed through the empty service exit as the security guard's boots slammed against the fallen man's ribs, producing dull, terrible sounds. Grace felt cold sweat trickle down her back under her faded blue uniform, stained from years of hard, invisible work. Her hands, calloused from decades of cleaning other people's floors, erasing the messes of the rich, now trembled as they held the body of a stranger. The yellow light from the lamppost flickered intermittently, revealing and hiding the shattered face of the homeless man, covered in purple bruises and blood streaming from his broken nose. Everyone believes that poor people only think of themselves, of their own survival, that they don't have the luxury of thinking about others, that those who have little cannot afford to help others, that charity is a privilege for those with full bank accounts, that kindness is for rich people who can afford to soothe their guilty consciences with checks to charitable institutions. But that night, a cleaner earning minimum wage proved that this belief is a cruel and convenient lie, the lie the comfortable tell themselves to justify their indifference to the suffering of others. Elegance Galleria, Uptown New York City, 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in July 2024, when the night was coldest and the streets most deserted. The most exclusive luxury mall in North America had just closed its bulletproof glass doors to the last of its millionaire clients. While wealthy customers drove their imported cars home, listening to classical music and thinking about their rich people problems, the invisible cleaning crew began their night shift. At the back service exit, far from the security cameras and the eyes of a society that prefers not to see certain things, true human nature would be tested, and the result of that test would change lives in ways no one could have predicted at that moment. Grace faced the impossible dilemma of defending a homeless man being beaten by guards armed with batons, knowing it meant losing the job that had single-handedly supported her 3 children for 7 years. She didn't know the homeless man was the billionaire owner of the mall in disguise, testing the humanity of his employees in a social experiment he had repeated in 47 other malls. All she knew was that a human being was being kicked to death while others watched and did nothing, and that if she didn't do something right then, she would have to live the rest of her life knowing she had been a coward when it mattered most. That she had chosen money over dignity, security over her soul. Sometimes, defending a stranger costs you everything you have, but not defending them costs you your soul, and that's a much more expensive price to pay. This was the phrase Grace would repeat later, when journalists asked how she found the courage to do what she did. But in that moment, trembling on the cold ground, she wasn't thinking of pretty phrases or moral lessons. She was only thinking that she wouldn't be able to look her children in the eye the next day if she let that man die. That every day she taught Lucas, Maria, and Peter about doing the right thing, and that words mean nothing without actions. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between doing the right thing and protecting yourself, leave a comment. Tell your story. Say what you chose, and whether or not you regret that choice. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to leave a like so more people can discover stories of courage like this one. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will move you and make you think about your own choices. Because in the end, we are defined not by what we say we would do, but by what we actually do when no one is watching. 6 hours earlier, at 6 p.m. that same Friday, Grace arrived for another shift as she had for 18 years, punctual as a clock. She carried her dented aluminum lunch pail, its lid not closing properly, and her worn Bible in a torn bag that was already old when she got it from a former employer. "Good evening, Ms. Grace," greeted the security guard at the service entrance, Marcus, with that professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. She had no idea that in a few hours this same man would be threatening to beat her, that his polite greeting would turn into death threats. It all seemed like just another ordinary night of invisible work, one among thousands of identical nights that blurred into one another. Grace was 52, a single mother of 3 children, Lucas, 17, Maria, 14, and Peter, 9, each with their own dreams and needs that weighed on her tired shoulders. She had worked as a cleaner at Elegance Galleria for 18 years, always on the night shift because it paid an extra $20 a week. Her biggest dream was to see Lucas get into engineering school the following year, fulfilling the dream she could never have. She saved every penny of her minimum wage salary, cutting all personal expenses to pay for her eldest son's prep courses. Grace believed deeply that dignity doesn't come from what you have in the bank, but from how you treat others when no one is watching or judging you. She had been a widow for 7 years, ever since her husband Robert died in a work accident on a construction site, falling from a poorly installed scaffold. She raised her 3 children alone on a cleaner's salary, with no help from anyone, no pension because the company claimed it was his negligence. Known among her colleagues as the woman who never complained, even when facing daily humiliations from customers who treated her like part of the furniture. She had a habit of bringing an extra lunch to share with homeless people she met near the subway on her way home. Her Christian faith was what kept her going in the toughest moments, when the money ran out before the end of the month and she didn't know how she would feed her children. Her main goal was to ensure her children had opportunities she never had, that they could study and have dignified professions. She needed to keep that job at all costs. It was the family's only source of income. There was no plan B or safety net. She dreamed of seeing Lucas graduate as an engineer, Maria become the teacher she always wanted to be, and Peter grow up with dignity and health despite his chronic asthma. But above all, she wanted her children to learn that doing the right thing was worth more than any money or material comfort. That character is not for sale, not to be negotiated, not to be traded for security or convenience. At 11:30 p.m., while cleaning the third-floor corridor near the closed designer stores, Grace heard screams coming from the service exit. They were screams of pain, desperate pleas for mercy, someone begging them to stop, saying he hadn't done anything. She ran down the service stairs, her heart pounding, sensing something terrible, her hands sweating as she gripped the handrail. As she opened the heavy metal door that led to the back parking lot, she froze for a second that felt like an eternity. 3 security guards, Marcus, Jefferson and Richard Ware, brutally beating a homeless man who had fallen to the ground, kicking him relentlessly while the man tried to protect himself. It was the most luxurious mall in New York City, with 500 international brand stores that most Americans only knew by name and millionaire clients who spent in an afternoon what Grace earned in a year. Located uptown, it had security cameras in every corridor, every store, every restroom, except at the service exit, where disposable employees came and went. The cleaning crew worked only at night, from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., when the mall closed to the public and the rich returned to their mansions. The security guards had a reputation for being extremely strict with undesirables who tried to enter homeless people, street vendors, people who didn't fit the mall's profile. There was an unofficial culture of clearing the area of homeless people who approached the mall as if they were pests to be exterminated. Marcus, 35, leader of the night security team, an ex-cop kicked off the force for excessive brutality, known for his gratuitous violence, which he called efficiency. Jefferson, 28, the youngest, always trying to impress Marcus with his toughness, wanting to prove he was man enough for the job. Richard, 42, the quietest but equally violent when provoked, with a history of 3 assault complaints that were archived. The 3 had a history of expelling homeless people with excessive violence, breaking ribs and jaws, but were never punished because they were maintaining the standard. They were seen by management as efficient in maintaining the establishment standard, corporate code for doing the dirty work no one wanted to admit needed to be done. The homeless man on the ground looked to be about 60, with torn clothes reeking of sewage and old sweat, a long, dirty beard full of food scraps. His face was covered in fresh blood that streamed down the deep grooves of his aged skin, one eye already swollen and purple, shut from a blow. He moaned in pain as he tried to shield himself from the kicks coming from all sides, his thin arms feebly trying to cover his head. No one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that this broken man was Edward Morgan, 58, the billionaire owner of the mall and 46 others across the country. Edward had disguised himself as a homeless man that night to conduct a test he had been running for 6 months, to find out if anyone, any person in his empire, still had genuine, selfless compassion. The true antagonist was not the individual security guards, men who followed orders and unwritten rules, but a system that dehumanizes the vulnerable, a corporate culture where maintaining standards meant violently expelling anyone without money to spend, as if poverty were a crime. The collective mindset that defending people like that wasn't worth the risk of losing your job, reputation, security. There was always a good excuse. The daily choice of thousands of people to look away when injustice happens right in front of them, telling themselves, "It's not my problem." And the paralyzing fear that prevents good people from acting when it matters most, the fear that turns witnesses into silent accomplices. Grace had known the three guards for years, always greeting them politely when she arrived and left work, exchanging a few words about the weather. They saw her as an invisible part of the scenery, never truly noticing her as a person with a name, a story, a family, just the cleaner. She had never had any problems with them, always maintaining a respectful professional distance, doing her job and leaving without causing trouble. But that night, for the first time in 18 years of invisible, obedient work, she would place herself directly against them in a way there was no coming back from. And the homeless man being beaten was a complete stranger to Hero, so she thought, never imagining that this encounter would change both their lives forever. "Stop! For God's sake, you're going to kill him!" Grace shouted, running toward the guards, her voice echoing in the cold, empty parking lot. Marcus stopped mid-kick, which had been aimed at the homeless man's ribs, and turned to her with an expression of surprise mixed with pure anger. "Grace, go back to your work and pretend you didn't see anything," he ordered coldly, as if giving a simple instruction on where to store cleaning supplies. But she didn't stop, didn't slow down, and kept walking until she stood between the guards armed with batons and the bleeding, fallen man on the ground. That was the moment that changed everything, the instant she chose a stranger over her own safety, the moment everything she had built over 18 years hung by a thread. Grace's legs trembled uncontrollably as she positioned herself as a human shield over the homeless man who groaned in pain beneath her. "I can't let you do this. This is wrong, so wrong," she said, her voice shaky but surprisingly firm for someone terrified. Jefferson let out a cruel laugh that echoed in the empty lot. "You're going to lose your job for a bum who doesn't even shower?" Grace swallowed hard, thinking of her children at home waiting for her to bring food, thinking of Lucas, who dreamed of engineering school, of Maria, who loved to study, of Peter, who needed expensive medicine. But her hands tightened on the injured man's shoulders, feeling his warm blood stain her uniform. "Then let me lose it. But you won't kill him while I'm here, while I'm conscious and breathing." Marcus took a threatening step toward Grace, his face inches from hers, so close she could feel his breath and see the bulging veins of anger. "You have 5 seconds to get out of the way before I drag you out of here and throw you in with this trash," he snarled in a low, dangerous voice. Richard took out his baton and slapped it against his palm in a clear threat, the sound of hard plastic against skin echoing like a countdown. Jefferson began to count aloud, each number sounding like a sentence. 1, 2, 3, 4. Grace closed her eyes and began to pray quietly, the words of the Hail Mary leaving her lips automatically, but she didn't move a single inch. "Grace, you have 3 kids to raise on your own. Are you really going to throw all that away for this nothing?" Marcus said, changing tactics, his voice now almost gentle, almost paternal. It was true she would be throwing everything away by defending this man she didn't even know, whom she had never seen before in her life. Lucas wouldn't have money for the prep course that cost $150 a month. Maria would have to drop the tutoring that kept her at the top of her class. Peter would go without his asthma medication that cost $60 a month. Everything she had built over 18 years of hard work, 18 years of cleaning the floors, of people who didn't even see her as human, would be destroyed that night. But looking at the homeless man's bloodied face, at his eyes silently pleading for help, she whispered, "My children need food, but they need a mother who does the right thing even more, a mother who can look in the mirror without feeling ashamed." "Does anyone here see anything happening?" Marcus yelled to other employees who were watching from a distance, hidden behind pillars and parked cars. Everyone quickly returned to their posts, pretending they hadn't seen anything, pretending there wasn't a woman risking her life to defend a stranger. Grace realized she was completely alone. No colleague would come to her aid. No witness would stay to support her version of the events. The security cameras purposefully didn't cover that area. It was her word against 3 uniformed guards armed with batons. If they decided to hurt her too, to throw her and the homeless man into some dumpster, there would be no witnesses, no justice, no consequences. Jefferson tried to pull Grace away by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave bruises. She clung to the injured body with all her might, her fingers intertwined in the man's torn, dirty clothes. "No! You'll have to drag me! You'll have to beat me too!" Richard raised the baton over her head, the black plastic gleaming under the yellow light of the lamppost. "Last chance, you stubborn, stupid old woman." The homeless man on the ground, semi-conscious and nearly passing out from the pain, murmured weakly, "Leave. It's not worth it. Go away. Save yourself." But Grace held on even tighter, her tears falling onto his battered face. "I won't abandon you. God forgive me if I do, if I'm a coward now." Marcus grabbed his radio, pressing the button firmly. "I'm calling the manager now. You're fired, Grace. Fired for insubordination and interference." Those words fell like a death sentence on her, each syllable weighing like lead on her racing heart. Fired meant no money for the rent that was already 3 days late, no food on the table that was already nearly bare, Lucas giving up on college before he even tried. It meant going home and explaining to her children that she had chosen a dirty, smelly stranger over their future, their food, their security. For one endless second, Grace almost stood up and left, almost chose safety over a clear conscience. But then she felt the homeless man's trembling hand weakly grasp her wrist, a silent plea not to be abandoned, and she knew she had no choice but to stay. "Fine. Fire me. Sue me. Destroy me," Grace said, tears streaming down her face, her voice broken but determined. "But before you do that, before you throw me on the street like trash, let's call an ambulance for this man who is dying." Marcus laughed with contempt, a cold, cruel laugh. "An ambulance? For this human garbage who shouldn't even be alive? Have you gone completely insane?" Jefferson kicked the ground near Grace's head in intimidation, his boot passing so close she felt the wind. "We're going to drag you both out of here and throw you in the trash where you belong, where people like you should be." Richard was already taking out his phone to call the general manager, to make the firing official and begin the process of removing Grace from the premises. At that moment, when all seemed lost, and Grace was already accepting her fate of destruction, a firm voice echoed in the parking lot. "What is going on here? Someone explain this to me now." It was Sandra, the mall's HR manager, who had come back to get some documents she had forgotten in her 5th-floor office. She looked at the scene with visible horror. Grace covered in the homeless man's blood, the 3 guards with batons, the broken man on the ground groaning in pain. "Marcus, explain this now, and don't lie to me because I saw everything from my office window," she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and shock. Grace felt a spark of hope. Maybe she wasn't completely alone after all. Maybe someone with power had seen what was happening on that terrible night. Marcus quickly changed his tone, assuming a professional posture, smoothing his uniform. "Ma'am, this dangerous trespasser was threatening employees at the service exit." And Grace here got hysterical and refused to leave when we politely asked her to continue her work. He lied, with terrifying ease. Jefferson added to the lie, his voice suddenly respectful. "We were just removing a security threat, and she interfered aggressively." Grace looked at Sandra with desperation, her eyes pleading to be believed. "That's a lie. They were killing this man for no reason, just because he's homeless. Sandra looked between the uniformed, trustworthy guards and the cleaner covered in blood and tears, between the word of trained professionals and a hysterical woman. Grace saw in her expression the fatal doubt. Who would Sandra believe? Who had more credibility in this impossible situation? Grace, are you telling me that 3 trained professional security guards were beating a man for no reason at all? Sandra asked with clear skepticism in her voice, her eyebrow arched in disbelief. Marcus seized the opportunity perfectly. Ma'am, with all due respect, Grace has been under a lot of stress lately. Family problems, financial issues, a lot of pressure. It was a blatant lie, but it sounded plausible, like something that would make sense to explain the irrational behavior of a troubled employee. Grace felt the floor give way beneath her, the word of a cleaner against 3 well-dressed, articulate security professionals. Please, just call an ambulance. Look at the state of this man. He's dying, she pleaded, pointing to the homeless man who could barely breathe, blood trickling from his mouth. That's when Sandra bent down to get a better look at the man, approaching cautiously, and something glinted brightly in the flickering yellow light of the lamppost. It was a watch on the man's grimy wrist, not just any cheap street vendor watch, but a Patek Philippe, valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars, the kind collectors fight to own. Sandra froze completely, her eyes wide with absolute shock, her face turning as pale as if she'd seen a ghost. Marcus, what kind of homeless man wears a watch that costs more than a house uptown? She asked slowly, each word heavy with terrible implications. The 3 guards turned pale instantly, finally realizing that something was terribly wrong, that this was no ordinary homeless man. Grace looked at the watch, confused, not understanding what was happening, not comprehending the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Sandra immediately called the mall's director of security, her voice trembling on the phone. He arrived in 15 minutes with other managers. 3 more managers showed up in luxury cars, all in a panic at the sight of the scene, whispering among themselves with expressions of terror. They began to discuss in low voices, standing about 30 feet away, completely ignoring Grace and the injured man who continued to bleed. Grace overheard frightening fragments of their conversation. $1 billion lawsuit could destroy the entire mall, contain the damage before it leaks to the press. Our careers are over. She realized their concern was not for the victim, not for the broken human being on the ground, but for the corporate consequences, for saving their own positions and their jobs. While they waited for the ambulance that had finally been called, Grace held the homeless man's hand and thought with a broken heart, did I do the right thing? Did I ruin my children's lives for nothing? Her children were asleep at home, unaware that their mother had just lost her job, unaware that they would wake up to a different world the next day. Lucas would have to give up on college before even taking the entrance exams, giving up the dream he had nurtured since he was a child of becoming an engineer. Maria would cry when she learned there was no money for her books, for her classes, to achieve her dream of being a teacher, and Peter, her 9-year-old baby, would have asthma attacks without the expensive medicine that cost $60 a month. I sacrificed my children for a stranger, she thought, her heart shattered, silent tears streaming down her tired face. One of the managers approached Grace with a brown envelope, his expression trying to be sympathetic but looking fake. Grace, we understand this has been a very difficult night for everyone. Here's $2,000 as compensation for the stress, but you need to sign a document stating that you saw nothing irregular happen here today, he explained, placing papers in front of her. Grace looked at the money with trembling hands. It was more than she earned in an entire year of hard work, more than she had ever had in her entire life. With that, Lucas could attend the prep course for a whole year. She could pay 6 months' rent in advance, and there would be food on the table. But it would mean lying, it would mean saying the guards had done nothing wrong, it would mean letting them go unpunished to do this to other homeless people. "I'm not signing this," she said, returning the envelope, her hands shaking with the effort of refusing so much money. "Grace, be reasonable. Think of your children who need you," the manager insisted, upping the offer with more papers. $5,000. "It's either this or you leave here with nothing and get sued for interfering with the establishment's security operations." It was a clear threat wrapped in corporate language: take the bribe or be legally destroyed, sued until she had nothing left. Grace looked at the homeless man being carefully placed on a stretcher by the paramedics, his body broken and battered. That man, whoever he was under those dirty clothes, had nearly died while everyone watched and did absolutely nothing. "You can sue me, threaten me, destroy me financially and socially," she said, her voice firm despite the tears, "but I will not pretend that everything is okay. What happened here tonight is deeply wrong, and someone needs to say it." How many times have you seen something wrong happening right in front of you and stayed silent because speaking up would cost too much? If this story is touching your heart, making you think about your own choices, leave a like so more people can reflect. Share in the comments, would you have Grace's courage to refuse $5,000 to do the right thing? Subscribe to the channel to follow the conclusion of this emotional story that will change the way you see courage. Because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's having fear and doing the right thing anyway. Sandra, who had initially doubted Grace out of sheer prejudice and conformity, now looked at her with a completely different expression, with something that resembled respect. "You just turned down $5,000 that could literally change your life and your children's lives," she whispered, impressed as she drew closer. "Why? Why refuse so much money?" she asked with genuine curiosity, as if she couldn't comprehend the logic of that decision. Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand, which was stained with blood. "Because my children ask me every day what is right and wrong, what we should do when no one is watching. How can I look at them tomorrow and teach them about dignity, about character, about doing the right thing, if I sell my soul for money?" she explained, her voice cracking. Sandra looked down, ashamed of her own complicity in a corrupt system that valued appearances over truth. What no one at the scene knew was that the homeless man, Edward Morgan, the billionaire owner of 47 malls, was wearing a hidden recording device. Everything had been meticulously recorded in high-quality video and audio. The brutal beatings, the death threats, the attempted bribe, every word spoken. But most importantly, more important than anything else, the incredible courage of a cleaner defending a stranger with nothing to gain had been recorded. Edward, though semi-conscious in the ambulance being taken to a private hospital, smiled faintly through the pain that shot through every inch of his body. He had searched for months, testing in 47 different malls for someone with genuine kindness in his corporate empire, and he had finally found it, not in an MBA executive, not in a well-paid manager, but in the invisible woman who had been cleaning his hallways for 18 years. Grace was escorted out of the mall by the same guards who had threatened her, now silent and tense, knowing something was wrong. Her personal belongings, the old aluminum lunch pail with the broken lid, the worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, a photo of her 3 children, were thrown into a torn plastic grocery bag. "You'll never work in any mall in this city again, we'll make sure of that," Marcus spat, a mixture of hatred and fear in his voice, his own career now hanging by a thread. "We'll call every mall and tell them you're a problematic, hysterical employee who makes up lies," Jefferson threatened. Grace walked alone to the bus stop at 2 a.m., unemployed, threatened, not knowing how she would tell her children that everything had changed. But strangely, amidst the absolute despair, she felt an inexplicable peace for having done the right thing, for being able to look in the mirror without shame. 3 days later, Grace was at home, trying to explain to her children that there wasn't enough food for everyone to eat their fill. Lucas, her 17-year-old eldest son, held her calloused hand tightly. "Mom, you did the right thing. I'm proud of you, even if it means I can't take the prep course." But Maria cried silently in the corner of the old sofa, knowing her dream of becoming a teacher was now even more distant without money for books. Peter coughed incessantly, his asthma attacks worsening without the $60 medication they could no longer afford. The rent was due in 4 days, and she didn't have a single cent, not even coins at the bottom of her purse. Eviction seemed inevitable. It was then that the doorbell rang, a man in an impeccable Italian suit holding a genuine leather briefcase that cost more than 6 months of her salary. "Ms. Grace Miller, my name is Dr. August Fields, Mr. Edward Morgan's attorney," the man said, handing her a heavy, gold-embossed business card. Grace looked at it, confused, turning the card over in her hands. "Who? I don't know anyone by that name. You must have the wrong person." "The man you saved 3 days ago at the Elegance Galleria service exit," he explained with a gentle smile. "He would very much like to speak with you personally about the events of that night and express his gratitude." "But that was a homeless man being beaten," she began to say, her voice confused and trembling. The lawyer smiled even more kindly. "That homeless man is the billionaire owner of the Elegance Galleria and 46 other malls across the country, with an estimated fortune of $2 billion. Grace felt her legs go weak and had to lean against the doorframe, the world spinning around her. "Is he going to sue me for interference? For getting involved where I shouldn't have?" Grace asked with a shaky voice, already imagining her life being destroyed by a lawsuit. Her whole body trembled at the thought that, on top of being unemployed, she would be sued by a billionaire with armies of lawyers who could legally crush her. "On the contrary, ma'am," replied Dr. Fields with a warm expression. "He wants to thank you personally for your extraordinary courage and discuss something very important. There's a Mercedes-Benz waiting to take you to Mount Sinai Hospital, where he is recovering from his injuries," he said, gesturing to the luxurious black car parked on her humble street. Grace looked at her hungry children, at the miserable apartment with its broken furniture, and was deeply suspicious. Why would a billionaire want to talk to me? I'm just an unemployed cleaner. But something in the lawyer's sincere expression made her agree, and she grabbed her old purse to go. Along with the lawyer was Sandra, the mall's HR manager, but she was no longer wearing the impeccable corporate uniform she always wore. "Grace, I resigned from Elegance Galleria 3 hours after that night," she said, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "When I learned the full truth of what happened, when I found out who that man really was and the test he was conducting, I couldn't continue working for a corrupt system that allows such things. I came to apologize for doubting you that night, for considering believing the guards instead of you," she said, her voice cracking with guilt. Grace hugged her tightly, 2 women broken by the system in different but equally devastating ways. "You don't need to apologize. You arrived when it mattered most and changed everything," Grace whispered, as Sandra cried on her shoulder. At Mount Sinai Hospital, in the presidential suite on the 10th floor that looked more like a 5-star hotel, Edward Morgan lay in a luxurious hospital bed, bandaged but conscious and smiling. "Grace, please, sit down," he said, his voice still weak, but surprisingly warm for a billionaire, pointing to a leather armchair. "I need you to fully understand what happened that night and why it happened," he said, looking directly into her eyes. Edward explained that he had purposefully disguised himself as a homeless man, spending weeks perfecting the disguise with a professional makeup artist and costumer. "I've done this in all 47 of my malls over the last 6 months, visiting each one disguised as a homeless man," he revealed with a sad expression. "I wanted to find out if genuine kindness still existed anywhere in my corporate empire, if any of my thousands of employees had real compassion. he explained, his voice breaking with emotion. In 47 malls, on 47 different nights, disguised as an abused homeless man. Do you know how many people helped me? How many employees intervened? Edward asked, tears beginning to stream down his bruised face. Grace shook her head, her heart pounding as she anticipated the devastating answer. None. Absolutely no one in 47 malls, among thousands of employees, did what you did, he said, his voice completely broken now, sobbing. I was beaten 12 times by security guards, spat on, humiliated, urinated on, thrown into dumpsters as if I were actual human trash. Thousands of my employees saw me being abused, violated, broken. Every single one of them looked the other way, choosing their careers over helping me, he continued, until you, who had absolutely nothing to gain and literally everything to lose, risked it all for a complete stinking stranger, he said, holding her hand. On a tablet, Edward showed Grace the shocking recordings he had made in all 47 malls over the 6-month experiment. Horrific videos, difficult to watch, of employees laughing at him as he was abused, security guards beating him with sadistic pleasure, managers ordering his violent removal as if they were exterminators. My own company, which I built from scratch working 80-hour weeks for 30 years, has become a dehumanizing machine, he said, his voice filled with guilt. And I was complicit by creating a corporate culture that values profit and appearances over people and basic human dignity, he admitted with deep shame. Grace saw tears streaming continuously down the billionaire's bruised face, this powerful man crying like a broken child. You showed me that I failed as a human being by building this empire, but that there is still hope because people like you exist, he said with profound gratitude. You didn't just save me physically, you saved my faith in humanity, which I was completely losing. You lost absolutely everything for me, Edward said, holding Grace's calloused, rough hand between his own soft ones. Your job that supported 3 children, your financial security, your children's future all destroyed in an instant. And I was no one important to you at that moment, just a dirty, smelly, homeless man that society considers disposable and invisible, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Grace wiped away her own tears. You weren't just anything, sir. You were a human being beaten to death while others watched. It doesn't matter if you were a billionaire or a real homeless man, if you had a family or were alone in the world. No one, absolutely no one, deserves to be treated like that, like trash to be thrown away, she said with absolute conviction. Edward sobbed openly. You have just taught me more about humanity, about what really matters in life, than I've learned in 58 years of accumulating billions. Edward revealed that he had immediately fired everyone involved in the incident. The 3 security guards, Marcus, Jefferson, and Richard, 5 managers who attempted the bribe, and the director of security who oversaw the violence. But that's not nearly enough to fix the problem. The problem is systemic, cultural. It's in the company's roots, he admitted with frustration. My entire company, all 47 locations, needs a complete overhaul of its values, its culture, of how we treat vulnerable people, he explained his plan. And I urgently need someone who deeply understands what truly matters in life to help me with this impossible transformation, he said, looking at her intently. Grace looked at him, confused and scared. Mr. Morgan, I'm just a cleaner with no formal education, no college degree. No, Edward interrupted firmly, raising a hand. You are the only person in 47 malls, among thousands of employees, who passed the most important test of all, the test of humanity. Grace thought deeply about her children at home, about Lucas, who had dreamed of being an engineer since he was 8 and got a book about bridges, about Maria, who loved to study and had always wanted to be a teacher. She thought of Peter coughing without his expensive medicine, of asthma attacks that could kill him if not treated properly and quickly, but she also thought of the man before her, a billionaire completely broken on the inside after discovering that his $2 billion empire was morally bankrupt. "Mr. Morgan," she said softly, choosing each word with care, "money doesn't make anyone better or worse, more or less worthy of respect. What does are the choices we make when no one is watching, when there are no cameras, when there is no expected reward," she said with simple yet profound wisdom. Edward smiled through the tears that continued to fall. "That is exactly why, for this wisdom that no university can teach, I desperately need you in my company. Grace, I want to offer something very significant to you and your family," Edward said, and his lawyer, Dr. Fields, opened a leather folder with legal documents. "First, $100,000 in cash as a sincere thank you for saving my life that brutal night," he announced. Grace was completely stunned, her mind unable to process such an absurd number. It was more money than she would see in her entire lifetime working as a cleaner. Second, a position as Director of Human Culture across all 47 of my companies, with a monthly salary of $10,000 plus full benefits, he continued. Third, full academic scholarships for your 3 children at the best private schools and universities in the country, including all materials and expenses, he concluded. Grace's hands trembled uncontrollably as she held the legal documents the lawyer placed before her, her heart beating so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. "But I have non-negotiable conditions before I accept," Grace said surprisingly, leaving everyone in the room completely shocked by her courage. Edward smiled, intrigued, impressed by the woman who maintained her dignity even in poverty. "State your conditions. I'm listening intently." "I accept the money, the job, and the scholarships for my children, but only if we use a significant portion of these resources to create a robust protection program for the homeless," she said with a firm voice. "And if every employee in all 47 malls is contractually obligated to perform monthly volunteer work at shelters, nursing homes, and orphanages," she continued her list of demands. "I want your employees to understand viscerally that vulnerable people are complete human beings, not obstacles to be violently removed from the path," she concluded with passion. The silence in the room was absolute, everyone staring at the unemployed cleaner negotiating with a billionaire as an equal. "To make this work in the brutal reality of the corporate world, you will face absolutely brutal resistance from all sides," Edward warned honestly, not hiding the challenges. "Executives with MBAs from Harvard will deeply resent you. Managers will boycott your every initiative. You will be seen as an intruder who doesn't deserve to be in that elite corporate space. They will say cruel things behind your back and to your face that a former cleaner with no college degree isn't qualified to direct anything," he continued, painting a realistic picture. "Your life will become a brutal daily battle against class prejudice, corporate sabotage, and constant attempts to make you give up and go back to your place," he finished. Grace took a deep breath, thinking of everything she had faced. "I cleaned other people's floors for 18 years while being completely invisible, treated like furniture. To be hated but finally seen and heard is significant progress," she replied with a strength that surprised even herself. At that exact moment, the TV in the room, tuned to a news channel, showed something devastating. Marcus, the former lead security guard, was giving a live interview to a journalist. "This cleaner blatantly lied about everything that happened. We never violently touched the homeless man. She concocted an absurd story to extort millions from a vulnerable billionaire," he said, playing the part of an unjustly accused victim. The report showed Grace leaving the hospital in simple, old clothes next to Edward's lawyer in his expensive suit, creating a suspicious contrast. The online comments scrolling across the screen were absolutely cruel. "Another opportunist. Perfect setup to get rich without working. cleaner version of a gold digger. She was probably in on it with him. Grace felt the entire world come crashing down on her, her reputation being completely destroyed publicly for millions of viewers. Grace's old phone began to ring incessantly, dozens of journalists wanting exclusive interviews, offering money for her story. Neighbors in her humble apartment building looked at her with absolute suspicion as she passed, whispering and pointing as if she were a criminal. Lucas came home from school crying desperately. "Mom, all my classmates are saying you're a fraud, that you set it all up to get rich," he sobbed in her arms. Maria deleted all her social media accounts after being brutally attacked by strangers. "Daughter of a con artist. Your mum's a gold digger." Horrible messages. Peter was being violently bullied at his elementary school. "Your mum's an opportunist." "Your mom lied," the other children shouted, surrounding him at recess. Grace sat on the cold floor of her miserable apartment and questioned the God she had always trusted. "God, I did the right thing with a pure heart, and I'm being completely destroyed in public. Why? Why this injustice?" Edward called a massive national press conference in the luxurious main lobby of the Elegance Galleria for the next day, inviting all the major networks. Hundreds of journalists from all over the country, cameras from every TV station, intense spotlights that turned the mall into a giant studio. Grace stood beside him on the stage, absolutely terrified, having never been under so many judgmental eyes at once, feeling naked and exposed. "Before I say a word, before any questions, I want you all to watch something very carefully," Edward said in a firm voice, and a giant LED screen lit up dramatically. It was the complete, high-definition recordings of the 6-month experiment. The brutal beatings in 47 malls, Grace bravely throwing herself over him, the explicit threats from the guards, the blatant bribery attempt from the managers. The room of hundreds fell into absolute shocked silence, many journalists covering their mouths in horror at the violence. "For 6 entire months, I meticulously disguised myself as a homeless man in all 47 of my malls across the country," Edward revealed, his voice deeply emotional for the cameras. "I suffered brutal violence, inhuman humiliation, and complete dehumanization in every single one, without a single exception," he continued, tears beginning to fall. "Thousands of my employees saw me being abused, beaten, broken. All of them, without exception, looked the other way, choosing security over conscience," he said, pausing. "Except for this extraordinary woman." He pointed to Grace with profound admiration. "A cleaner earning minimum wage risked absolutely everything to defend a complete stranger, dirty and reeking. She didn't know who I was. She didn't expect any reward. There were no cameras filming for social media. She simply did the right thing, because it was the right thing to do," he said, his voice completely cracking. Tears streamed freely down his still bruised face, his body trembling with emotion. Live for millions to see. Marcus, Jefferson, Richard, and all the other guards involved are being criminally prosecuted for attempted murder and aggravated assault," Edward continued firmly. "The managers who tried to bribe Grace to cover up these crimes have been fired immediately and are being prosecuted for obstruction of justice and active corruption," he announced. "And I will personally allocate $10 million of my own assets to create the comprehensive homeless protection program that Grace so wisely proposed," he revealed, causing a stir. The room erupted in intense murmurs, journalists looking at each other in shock, cameras focusing on Grace, who was crying silently. "But most importantly, Grace will be the new director of human culture for all of my companies, with real executive power," he announced solemnly. "Because true competence doesn't come from a degree hanging on a wall. It comes from character tested in the most difficult situations imaginable," he concluded to emotional applause. A journalist from a major network raised his hand and asked the question everyone wanted to know. "Ms. Miller, why exactly did you defend a complete stranger, consciously knowing you would lose absolutely everything?" Grace approached the microphone, her hands visibly shaking. She had never spoken in public to so many people, with millions watching live. "Because I teach my 3 children every day that every life matters equally, regardless of their bank account," she said, her voice choked with emotion but clear. Rich, poor, powerful, invisible, homeless, billionaire, absolutely everyone deserves basic dignity and protection from violence, she continued, gaining confidence. "If I had turned my back on that man being beaten just to protect my meager job, I would have lost something infinitely more important than money, my humanity," she explained, tears streaming down her face. The room fell into a reverent and absolute silence. Dozens of veteran journalists discreetly wiping away tears, cameras capturing the historic moment. Grace had turned a moment of vulnerability into a lesson on humanity that the entire country urgently needed to hear. The powerful images from the press conference went viral instantly, 50 million views in the first 24 hours alone across all platforms. Grace went from opportunistic fraud to an absolute national hero in a matter of hours. The narrative completely flipped. Countless offers for interviews on every major national program, invitations to speak at universities and companies, even proposals from publishers to write an autobiography. But more important than any fame or recognition were the emotional messages from literally thousands of people saying she had inspired them to do the right thing in their own daily lives. Lucas, Maria, and Peter watched with immense pride as their mother was interviewed on national television. "Our mum saved someone and changed the country," they said, moved. The transformation was absolutely complete, not just of Grace's material life, but of the very cultural meaning of true success in American society. 6 months after that night that changed everything, Grace walked into the executive office on the 40th floor with a panoramic view of the entire New York City skyline, her office now. She wore an elegant professional suit, but still had the same characteristic humility in her eyes, the same essence she always had as an invisible cleaner. The walls were covered with photos of her visiting dozens of shelters, talking with employees at all levels, and implementing revolutionary corporate humanization programs. At the Elegance Galleria and in all 47 other malls in the group, the culture had changed so radically it felt like a completely different world. Employees now performed mandatory monthly volunteer work in vulnerable communities, nursing homes and orphanages, transforming perspectives and breaking down decades of ingrained prejudice. Homeless individuals were given free access to clean restrooms and drinking water inside all the malls, without exception or discrimination based on appearance. Security guards underwent rigorous 3-month training on human dignity, empathy, and the appropriate use of force before being hired. The rate of violence against vulnerable people in the vicinity of the 47 malls dropped an impressive 94% in just 6 months of the program's implementation. Each mall now had a dignity space with showers, clean clothes, and free social services for people experiencing homelessness. The mall's profits, surprisingly to corporate skeptics, had increased by 31% because customers valued companies with genuine social responsibility. Grace looked out the enormous window at the city, stretching to the horizon, and reflected deeply on her impossible journey. 6 months ago, I was literally cleaning this imported marble floor where my feet now stand as an executive, she thought with profound gratitude. Today, I strategically lead 5,000 direct and 15,000 indirect employees in the complete transformation of a massive corporate culture. But the greatest lesson she had learned wasn't about a meteoric social climb or the sudden wealth that changed her material reality. It was that doing the right thing never, ever depends on your social position, only on your courage to act when it matters. I had the exact same character when I was a cleaner earning minimum wage as I do now as a director earning $10,000 a month, she murmured to herself. Lucas was studying civil engineering at Columbia University, one of the best in the country, on a full scholarship personally offered by Edward. But more important than the university's prestige, he founded an innovative social engineering project to develop dignified housing in underserved communities. Maria, now studying at an elite private school, created a weekly book club to bring literature and literacy to children in municipal shelters. Peter, his asthma finally under complete control with top-tier medical treatment, visited children's hospitals every week to make sick kids smile with magic tricks. The three children didn't just learn about success by watching their mother prosper financially in a surreal, meteoric fashion. They learned the most valuable lesson, that integrity matters infinitely more than security, and that defending the vulnerable is the highest and purest form of human strength. Grace's extraordinary story demonstrably inspired 230 other major American companies to implement similar corporate humanization programs. What began as the Grace Protocol became a national corporate ethical standard. Mandatory empathy training, non-negotiable monthly volunteer work, and completely anonymous channels for reporting abuse. Edward created the prestigious annual Grace Miller Award, granting $20,000 to employees from any company who demonstrated similar extraordinary moral courage. The first emotional winner was a hospital cleaning assistant who bravely reported the systematic sexual harassment of a powerful surgeon. The movement was spreading organically like wildfire, humanizing America's cutthroat capitalism, one act of courage at a time, one person making a difference. Edward and Grace became deeply close friends, a seemingly impossible friendship between a billionaire and a former cleaner that defied all social norms. They had lunch weekly at simple restaurants she chose, discussing not aggressive business strategies, but life philosophy and the meaning of existence. "You brutally taught me that I had built a financial empire completely devoid of human meaning," Edward said at one of these intimate lunches, his voice filled with gratitude. "I had 47 malls worth billions, $2 billion in the bank, mansions, yachts, but I had completely lost my soul in the process of building it." Grace smiled wisely. "And you taught me that dignity and worth have absolutely nothing to do with a bank account. I had total dignity as a cleaner, and I have the same dignity as a director." They had both saved each other on that transformative night in completely different, yet equally important and complementary ways. Not everything was perfect. Grace still faced constant brutal resistance from arrogant executives who saw her as an unqualified intruder. There were frequent corporate sabotage attempts, cruel, prejudiced comments about the ex-cleaner who thinks she's an executive without deserving it circulating in the hallways. Some managers with expensive MBAs actively boycotted her programs, while others ridiculed her initiatives in closed-door meetings with other executives. But every resistance and every attack only exponentially strengthened her unwavering determination to transform that corrupt system. "They can hate me deeply, underestimate me constantly, and boycott me systematically," she said in a tense meeting with hostile executives. "But they cannot honestly deny the measurable results. Employee turnover is down 60%, customer satisfaction is up 40%, and net profit has increased by 25%. Humanity and profit were not irreconcilable opposites, as everyone believed. They were perfectly complementary when implemented correctly." Once a month, religiously, Grace returned to the Elegance Galleria at night and worked a full shift with the night cleaning crew. She would take off her executive suit, put on the blue cleaner's uniform, grab a mop and squeegee, and clean the hallways alongside her former colleagues. "I never, ever want to forget where I came from, who I was, and who I still essentially am," she would explain when asked about this unusual practice. The cleaners were initially extremely uncomfortable with the director working beside them, but they soon understood. She wasn't doing it for show or for marketing. She did it genuinely to remind herself that dignity isn't in the title we hold, but in how we treat every person, regardless of their position, and to show the invisible employees, in a concrete way, that their director understood exactly, viscerally, how difficult, exhausting, and undervalued their work was every single day. On the last day of that transformative 6th month, Edward proposed something completely unexpected that would expand everything. "Grace, I want to dramatically expand the homeless man test. Let's do it in public and private hospitals, in city and private schools, in elite universities. Let's see where else humanity is being systematically lost in our society," he explained with growing enthusiasm. Grace looked out the window thoughtfully, fearing the answer. What if no one passes these new tests? What if we discover that genuine kindness is truly dying in this country? Edward smiled with renewed hope. "You passed when no one else did, which means, statistically, that others can pass somewhere. We just need to find them systematically. And when we find these rare people of genuine character, we will empower them with resources and a platform, just as we empowered you," he concluded with determination. The mission of cultural transformation was just beginning. There was a whole country to change, one courageous person at a time. 3 years after that fateful night that changed everything, Grace received a touching, handwritten letter from a 16-year-old girl in Philadelphia. "Ms. Miller, I watched your story on TV and cried for hours. My mother works as a cleaner and is humiliated every day by her wealthy employers. I was always ashamed of her, ashamed to tell my friends at school what my mom did. But you taught me that dignity doesn't come from a profession, it comes from character. Now I am immensely proud of my mother, who works honestly. Thank you for changing my life just by doing the right thing." Grace kept this letter in a frame on her executive desk next to the photo of her 3 children, because that letter represented something infinitely more valuable than the $100,000 she received, more important than her prestigious executive position. It represented that her courage had inspired a new generation to value dignity over appearances, character over social status, and humanity above all else.